Hey everyone, John P. here. In this video, I'm going to lay out for you exactly how the watch industry has been and continues to manipulate you as a watch collector. Now, this isn't going to be any kind of negative thing necessarily, but as being a watch dealer and being someone that's been in the industry for quite some time now, I have noticed things, picked up on things, as well as just had to deal with certain situations in the watch industry that, when put together, kind of resembles other types of hierarchies out there in the world, especially in different business scenarios, politics, for example. There's a lot of inner workings of the watch industry that I have charted out here that I'm going to share with you that have really started to collectively create this machine that is manipulating you and us as collectors. Because even though I have Del Rey Watch with my business partner Federico, where we buy, sell, and trade watches, predominantly pre-owned, we are independent. We are owned by ourselves, and we like to do our own thing, and we like to speak the truth. That's just our angle. That's what we believe in. That's how we started the company. We wanted to start a company that does just that. The fluff, the fuzz, kind of the propping up and bandwagon mentality is not something that personally I like to be a part of in any aspect of my life. And so we're going to go through all the different components here of the individual players and how their contributions, either individually or collectively in tandem with other players, create this scenario, which in my opinion is just not good for watch collectors. And after this video, you should be able to make that choice and decision for yourself in who really you'd like to work with, enjoy their content, engage with them, and really see what works for you. That's kind of the intent here, is give you what's going on and let you make the decision for kind of where you'd like to be based on what you kind of think in your own headspace. So let's talk about it. We need to talk about the collectors, right? Us as collectors. I'm a dealer, but I also collect. I've been in watches for a very long time, collecting since I was in high school. Right now I'm in my 30s. So we have collectors here that are really the focus, right? The consumers, the collectors, that is who needs to buy the watches to keep the watch industry running, right? So we have us at the bottom. And then with that, we have above us in kind of this hierarchy, we have the media, which is comprised of different YouTube channels, Instagram pages, but also the big players, you know, the zines, the magazines, the blogs, you know them, especially if you're a collector. And that's the other thing, is I'm not going to be necessarily talking about any specific people necessarily, or executives or writers or anything like that, because I'm not trying to make this a he said, she said, or point fingers or try to create any kind of negative altercation kind of a scenario here. I'm just trying to lay out how this works and kind of bring awareness here for you as a collector. But then on that same playing field, we have used watch dealers, we have new watch dealers, which are made up of authorized dealers as well as boutiques. And with this is the third party authorized dealers, which are privately owned jewelry stores anywhere in the world. But there has been a play and a push, especially if you follow the watch industry, you know, to get rid of the authorized dealers. Bakes an extra margin that ultimately the companies don't get to see, and it also loses control of the brand image, as well as the distribution when they use third-party dealers. And then we have gray market sellers. Now, above this tier of actors, and by the way, all of these can kind of interplay, but these four categories are always vying for the attention of the collector, because they need the collector the most to stay in, and they prop up the industry, right? So how this will work is the media will publish certain articles about certain new models, or maybe some models that need to sell, kind of different perspective op-ed pieces, but it's always very positive, and it's always shined in the light ultimately of, hey, this might be something you'd like to purchase as a collector. And we have the used dealers, which simply transact buying and selling watches, pretty much any condition. Doesn't have to be unworn, it can be used. They go back and forth with the collector, and that's kind of historically where this had been until the last 5 years, is people would have a guy for this, right? Oh, you like watches? Oh yeah, I've got a guy for that, right? Much like anything else. You have an accountant, you have a cobbler, I guess. Do people wear shoes anymore? At least that type. And then new dealers as well, there'd be some overlap. And the gray market as well, we'll touch on that in a second. So how it works is when the media, they publish these articles, you'll see similar articles on every zine, right? They'll talk about the same new releases in very much the same manner and fashion. Maybe they'll come up with their own pictures, or maybe they won't if it's not a big press release or not a big model, or maybe they didn't get a demo example. So they'll use the stock footage or the stock photos from the brand's websites. They all have press rooms where anybody can download pictures. I do it as well for this channel, high quality. They don't actually have to even have the watch any longer. Some of the big boys will do it, but we'll talk on why that is in just a second. Now, it's important to note that the brands have heavy influence over all of these categories, right? The brands pay high advertising dollars to some of these media outlets. Now, not all clicks are created equal, right? There are some media outlets that are known to provide more favorable media than others, and in which case they're going to get a much more favorable price for the advertising dollars. And that is the conversation that happens between the brands in the media. So you see this interplay, right? And if it's a notable blog, they need money to stay in business. So that if they don't take money from the brands, which they do, you'll see advertising banners all over the place. And some are a little more honest with mentioning that it's an advertorial, which is an advertisement, really, kind of, let's spin this, call it an advertorial. Or if they don't do that, or they want to taper that down, they need to get into one of the other categories. They need to get into becoming a used dealer. You'll know the companies that have done this in recent times. They need to get into becoming a new dealer. You'll know the companies that have done this in recent times. Or they get into gray market, which they're not going to do because the gray market, even though they say that the gray market is actually hurting the brands, it may be, but it's a necessary evil for the brands because historically, before the brands have caught on to the internet, go figure, took them decades, the brands use the gray market dealers to dump their excess inventory. So even though the brands would kind of put out this idea in the authorized dealers as well, in the boutiques, they'd put out this idea that the gray market, you don't know what you're getting, this and that. They know that there's still the budget conscious consumers, still the consumers that don't care about going and getting a glass of champagne, the consumers that will still buy at gray market, whether or not it comes with a warranty card. So the gray market is buying the watches from the brands that had to dump those watches on the market to meet other obligations that they had, or maybe they made too many. You can guess all the different reasons why a brand may have dumped watches. Not every brand is Rolex that could sell every watch they produce. And before brands started using the same components over and over and over in all of their watches, that's something we see today, brands wanting to reuse not only the movements, but the movement parts, as well as case parts, styles, dials, indices. They're just reusing everything across the board. Now it's much easier for them to say, hey, we're going to protect our brand image, not dump to the gray market. That hurts us in the long run. They're finally catching out. And they just reuse the parts, part them out, put them in other watches. That's kind of how they handle it today. It's smart, but it's what they're doing. So where are we here? We have the collectors who get stuck in this life cycle of seeing something in the media tells you to buy. They buy it. They get sick of it when the next thing in the media comes out. Everyone talks about it. It follows over to social. People share. They want to jump on the next bandwagon, so they go to the used dealer. They trade it in. Then they go to the new dealer. Might be the same, might be a different company. They buy the new thing, and it goes over and over and over, and you're kind of in this life cycle. Now, we won't touch on watch servicing, but with the in-house movements and the lock-on parts and components and getting away from stock off-the-shelf movements like you have from Etta, Sellita, so forth, at least when you get into a bit higher priced watches, there's additional components to kind of this collector life cycle that is being pushed for major control upwards in the hierarchy. Now, we will jump up here back to the brand level. Now, it's important to consider that the brand's main job is to not only portray what it means and find the collector that's going to resonate with them, but also make a quality watch as well as meet criteria and different performance indicators set forth by who owns the brand. If you look at who owns the majority of luxury watch brands today, this is something everyone has talked about countless times on the internet, myself included, but you have LVMH, which owns endless amounts of luxury products at this point. You have Richemont, very much the same, but heavily focused in jewelry and luxury goods. And then you have Swatch Group, which is predominantly watches, but they have some other timekeeping and mechanical and technological aspects of their business. And there's a little less, I'll interject here, there's a little less of them making more serious plays at control than the others. And then you have a new entrant to kind of this territory, which is Rolex, which just bought Bucher, one of the largest authorized dealer chains in the world, also probably now going to be the largest seller of Rolex watches, whereas previously it was Watches of Switzerland. But the thing to keep in mind is these are all, with the exception of Rolex, these are all publicly traded companies on some type of capital market out there. And with that comes additional requirements placed on the company, everything from governance to the things that they focus on to how they have to look forward in the future. And when you get into more of a corporate strategy for any type of organization or company, there are people that just base their whole career on how did they impress the guy above them or lady above them at this point, right? How did they impress the person above them so they can keep their job or jump over, whether it's sideways lateral to another brand, company, or upwards in that corporate structure? They don't have to be watch collectors. They don't have to care about us as watch collectors. They don't even have to care about the watches. There have been countless times in watch history where someone, a business person, made decisions to cut and reduce the quality of the watch components. Richemont does this all the time. They reuse the movements across the board. They've been caught in their Cartier watches putting plastic movement holders, and with the Panerai watches, undecorated movements. If we want to talk about the Brooklyn Bridge Panerai watch, which essentially, if you're not familiar, they put an undecorated movement in one of their watch models. Now, there are many things that they do to cut costs and cut corners here, but that's what happens when you get corporate. Now, moving up in the chain, because these are the holding companies, and some people are going to say, well, okay, they should still have a focus on watches because they have all been in the luxury watch industry for a very long time, sometimes, depending on how you look at it, 100 years, right? Well, above them, and this is something very important to note, is access to capital is incredibly necessary in this industry, especially at scale. At the time of this video, you can see some watch dealers that are no longer even buying watches. You know, there are some large dealers out there, won't name names, but we hear in the comment section, in messages all the time, some watch dealers and the big boys are not buying watches right now because of the way that the economies have quickly shifted and maybe their inventory is overpriced and they have too many employees, things like that. So I'm not kind of pointing the finger and saying leaner is necessarily better. It's just a different angle, right? It's more corporate scale. How big can we get this and how cool can some executives look to the executives above them to get bigger bonuses, stock options, compensation? It's not about the watches, it's about their pocketbook because it becomes just a job at a certain point in this hierarchy. And so above these companies, you have the access to capital, which includes the investment banks, certain investors, right? Certain brands like Audemars Piguet, they may be independent technically, but they're independent of everyone else. They still have private investors. There's a lot of people that are involved in holding equity in some of these companies behind the scenes that also have their own initiatives that they want to see. They also have their own priorities, and they also have the things that they want to see happen. And when we start talking about the money partners at this high level, they just want to get bigger returns, right? And what's going to get them bigger returns is getting these brands and companies to take more money from them, increasing their positions, and also having more brand equity in the bottom line brands so that more people keep buying. And they can do that by either selling more watches ultimately at the bottom, or they can do that by selling similar watches to you, the collector, at the bottom over and over again by telling you what you need to buy with the media, having you go to the different companies, which these guys are starting to own, by the way, right? It's important to note that these holding companies like LVMH and Richemont and Rolex are heavily getting into pre-owned because they're controlling the value of the watches and the perception of the watches so that you're more likely to buy just a different thing, right? So you buy that item, get bored of it, you sell it, you trade it in, you get another one, they take that profit, that margin on that transaction, the used transaction, the new transaction, the service transaction. Gray market goes away because they don't need to produce more watches to dump them because you and us as collector are essentially going to be buying, if not already, the same watches with the same movements masqueraded in different cases and different pitches in the media to create almost an illusion of change and difference and kind of always have the carrot in front of us. Now, I know this sounds like some type of wild, loony thing here, but if you just follow the way that people in this chain are held to each other, whether it's financially in control with the brands in the media has to stay on board with the brands, which ultimately has to stay on board with the holding companies and the financial backers, so they can't veer off that. Now, it's important to keep in mind, now many of you out there will wonder, well, why are there some dealers or some bloggers or some Instagram posters that are maybe not as popular as they could be? Or why are some people seemingly go in and out, or maybe there's certain collaborations? I'm trying to get your gears moving here, the wheels turning a little bit. I can't touch on every single topic here on how this works, but think about some of the people out there that maybe you've discovered, you're like, wow, why is no one talking about them? Why is no one buying and selling with them? Why, right? Why are there the brands co-signing certain people and others? And it all comes down to impressing the person above you. And it comes down to ultimately controlling the collector and extracting as much money from watch collectors as possible. And this isn't a new thing, right? You see it in the retail prices going up across the board. I've covered in this channel endless amounts of times how a micro brand watch costs $500 to produce the watch, talking stock movements and cases, but some of these micro brands are on par with watches that are even considered higher end from some of these brands. And oftentimes the differences are incredibly subtle. Maybe the watch is polished a little more, a couple of little angles here and there. The movement has a longer power reserve, but we're talking about changes that don't cost to implement as much, even nearly proportional to the amount of the retail price increase. Now, I'm not saying that any of this is necessarily a bad thing, but I think as collectors, it's important to keep in mind, especially with either the content you consume or who you choose to work with, or what you think is happening in the watch industry, to just take it with a grain of salt. Because even myself as a collector, and far before I got into the watch industry here, it was almost like a Wizard of Oz scenario, if you will, right? It's who's the guy, like the man behind the curtain kind of a thing. It's like, there's this big illusion of all these different options and all these different parts and pieces and, all these different collectors. And if you really look at it, it's all kind of the same, and it all flows back to who owns the companies, and it's the money. It all comes down to turning the dollars at the top for the shareholders, which are a lot of times, retirement accounts. Maybe, by proxy, many of you out there may even own shares in some of these companies without realizing it, just with the way the money flows. But that's all what it comes down to. Is it's not about the collectors. It's not necessarily about producing watches that you're going to love the most. It's some type of balance that's created of people trying to make a name for themselves and ultimately making more money for the banks at the top of this whole pyramid. I know, guys, a lot to digest here, but it's something I've been kind of thinking about as you see all this kind of consolidation, Rolex buying Bucher, and so many other things in the past. And so I wanted to share it with you because this is just kind of fun and interesting. I'm not really trying to say, oh, hey, don't buy a certain watch brand, or maybe don't do a certain thing. I mean, watches are still fun and cool, and it's a hobby for most of us. And I think it's just kind of interesting for us to know when we're either looking to buy a watch or sell a watch or price a watch, to kind of just think about it and say, this is kind of what it's going, and maybe look past some of the fluff. I could also talk about the auction houses That's probably worthy of a whole nother video in and of itself. You look at the relationship between the brands, the auction houses, and the media. We saw with the Franken Omega watch that sold at a record. The Speedmaster did a video on that, link in the description below. When there was like the Franken Speedmaster watch, you had people at the brands get it kind of passed off by the auction houses, give it the stamp of approval, use it in the media to sell you, Speedmaster reissues, and then they get busted because someone blows the whistle, and then they got to go back and everyone points their finger, and it all comes down to the money. Guys, let me know what you think in the comments below. I'd love to see it and hear it. And also any suggestions for videos or questions for the future, I'd love to respond in that way. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P.